That's what happened.
All right.
Anyway, and
Yeah.
they got a nice service person,
Yeah.
like from the Army or
Yeah.
something to be on.
For years, she looked like she was playing along, like she understood the rules and had quietly agreed to follow them. She smiled in interviews, showed up on screen exactly when expected, and gave just enough to keep the system satisfied. On the surface, everything seemed normal, controlled, polished, predictable. But behind that carefully maintained image, something else was building. Something quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous. Because from the very beginning, she had no intention of becoming what the industry wanted her to be. She didn't try to be louder to stand out, didn't reshape herself to fit beauty standards, and refused to become something easier to sell. And that made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite explain. Producers struggled to define her, executives couldn't figure out how to control her, and audiences didn't fully understand what they were watching yet. But none of that slowed her down, because she wasn't chasing approval, she was observing, watching people closely, the way they spoke when they were confident, the way they lied when they were not, the way they pretended to be something they weren't. And slowly, almost invisibly, she began turning those observations into something powerful. Not just performances, not just entertainment, but reflections of reality. The kind that made people laugh at first and then feel slightly uncomfortable seconds later. That's when the tension began. Because once you start exposing truth inside a system built on illusion, you don't just entertain, you disrupt, you challenge, you threaten. And what most people didn't realize at the time was that this wasn't just the beginning of a career, it was the beginning of a quiet war that almost no one could see. Long before there were cameras, scripts, or audiences, there was a small and ordinary life that didn't hint at anything extraordinary. No spotlight, no stage, no applause waiting at the end, just a world shaped by routine, discipline, and survival, where people didn't dream loudly because they didn't have the luxury to. She grew up surrounded by individuals who worked long hours, followed rules without questioning them, and lived within systems they rarely challenged. On the surface, everything seemed stable, predictable, and accepted. But even at a young age, she noticed something others overlooked: the contradictions hidden beneath everyday life. She saw how people said one thing in public and lived another in private, how smiles could hide exhaustion and confidence could mask fear. Where others saw normalcy, she saw complexity. And instead of ignoring those details, she absorbed them quietly, carefully, almost instinctively. As a child, she didn't just play the way others did, she recreated. She turned neighbors into characters, conversations into scenes, and silence into meaning. What seemed like imagination to everyone else was actually observation in its purest form. Every detail mattered to her: the way someone paused before speaking, the tone they used when they lied, the rhythm of everyday interactions. She was studying life without realizing it. And piece by piece, she was building something far deeper than simple creativity. Because even then, she wasn't trying to fit into the world around her. She was trying to understand it. And that difference, subtle but powerful, would eventually set her apart in ways no one could have predicted. Every life has a moment that quietly changes everything, a decision that doesn't seem dramatic at the time, but ends up rewriting the entire future. For her, that moment didn't arrive with certainty or clarity. It came with doubt, hesitation, and risk. She was already on a path that made sense, one that felt safe and acceptable to everyone around her. It was stable, predictable, and respected, the kind of path people don't question because it promises security. But deep down, something felt wrong. Not obviously wrong, not enough to alarm others, but enough to create a constant, quiet discomfort, like she was living a version of life that didn't fully belong to her. Then, almost unexpectedly, she stepped into something different. It wasn't planned, it wasn't strategic, but the moment she experienced it, everything shifted. The energy felt different, the freedom felt real, the connection was immediate and undeniable. For the first time, she wasn't just existing within a system, she was expressing something authentic. And once she felt that, there was no going back.
The decision that followed wasn't easy. Walking away from security never is. But she chose honesty over comfort, uncertainty over predictability. And that single decision changed everything. Because it didn't just redirect her path, it put her directly in conflict with an industry that wasn't built for people like her. An industry that valued control, predictability, and conformity. And she had just chosen the exact opposite. At first, the system didn't reject her completely. Instead, it tried something more subtle, reshaping her. The feedback sounded harmless, even helpful on the surface. Suggestions like be more relatable, smile more, or make it simpler were presented as guidance, as if they were trying to help her succeed. But underneath those words was something else entirely: control. Because what they were really asking her to do was to become less of herself and more of something familiar, something easier to understand, easier to sell, easier to manage. But she didn't adjust. She didn't soften her voice or dilute her perspective to fit expectations. She didn't trade authenticity for approval. And that refusal came with consequences. Opportunities became limited, paychecks were smaller, doors that seemed open suddenly closed without explanation. While others moved forward by adapting to the system, she stayed where she was, not because she couldn't move ahead, but because she refused to move in the wrong direction. Instead of rushing, she observed. Instead of changing, she refined. She understood something most people don't realize until it's too late, that shortcuts always come with a cost, and she wasn't willing to sacrifice who she was just to move faster, even if it meant being overlooked, even if it meant standing alone. Because for her, success without authenticity wasn't success at all. It was compromise, and she had already decided that wasn't an option. Then, slowly, something began to change. Not because she suddenly decided to fit in, not because she adjusted her voice or softened her edges, but because the world, just slightly, started catching up to her. The opportunity that came wasn't grand or guaranteed. It wasn't the kind people wait their whole lives for. In fact, most would have overlooked it completely. But when she stepped into that moment, she didn't treat it like a chance to prove herself. She treated it like a space to be fully, unapologetically real. And that's what made the difference. Because she didn't perform the way others did. She didn't try to impress. She transformed. What audiences saw wasn't just a character. It felt like someone they already knew, someone familiar, someone pulled straight out of real life. And that connection was immediate. It didn't rely on perfection or polish. It relied on truth. Messy, uncomfortable, undeniable truth. And people couldn't look away. For the first time, the thing that made her different became the very thing that made her stand out. But success didn't simplify anything, it complicated everything. Because now the same people who once questioned her began to see value in her, not as an artist, but as an opportunity. Suddenly there were offers, attention, interest, but with all of it came a quiet expectation that now she would finally play the game. And that was the real test. Because breakthrough moments don't just bring recognition, they bring pressure. Pressure to conform, pressure to repeat what works, pressure to become something predictable. But she had already come too far to turn back now.
Success doesn't mean freedom. In many ways, it introduces a new kind of control, one that's harder to see, but stronger to resist. With recognition came expectations, and with expectations came invisible boundaries, rules that were never clearly stated, but always enforced. What to say, what to accept, what to avoid. And the moment she began to step outside those boundaries, the system reacted. She started saying no, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. No to roles that felt empty, no to stories that didn't reflect truth, no to opportunities that came with conditions attached. And that's when the perception shifted. The same individuality that once made her intriguing now made her difficult. The same authenticity that once stood out was now labeled as risky. Words changed, attitudes shifted, and the support she once felt began to fade. But those labels were never about her talent, they were about control. Because the system doesn't resist talent, it resists independence. and she had proven, time and time again, that she couldn't be controlled. Opportunities didn't disappear overnight, but they became selective. Conversations became cautious, and behind closed doors, decisions were being made that had nothing to do with ability and everything to do with compliance. Still, she didn't bend. She didn't adjust her values to regain comfort, because she understood something deeper, that once you give in to control, you don't just lose opportunities, you lose yourself. And for her, that was never worth it, no matter the cost. From the outside, everything looked like success. Recognition continued to grow, audiences responded, and her presence became undeniable. To anyone watching, it seemed like she had made it. But what people couldn't see was everything happening behind the scenes, the pressure that never fully disappeared, the quiet resistance that followed her at every stage, the subtle ways the system reminded her that standing apart always comes with consequences. There were no public confrontations, no dramatic conflicts. Instead, it showed up in smaller, quieter ways, missed opportunities that were never explained, projects that suddenly fell through, conversations that shifted tone without warning. It wasn't obvious, but it was constant, and over time, that kind of pressure builds, not enough to break you, but enough to test you. There were moments when the easier path was right in front of her, moments where a single yes could have changed everything. More visibility, more money, more security, the kind of opportunities most people wouldn't think twice about accepting. But every time she faced that choice, she paused, not to calculate the benefit, but to understand the cost. Because she knew that not all success is equal. Some of it requires compromise. Some of it asks you to give up parts of yourself slowly, piece by piece, and she wasn't willing to do that. So again and again, she chose the harder path, not because it was easy, but because it was right. And that choice defined everything that followed. While the public saw her navigating a complex and demanding industry, there was another side of her life unfolding, quietly, away from attention. A connection that wasn't built on performance or expectation, but on understanding. A partnership grounded in creativity, trust, and something far more personal. It wasn't something she spoke about openly, not because it lacked importance, but because the world around her wasn't ready to accept it. At that time, being fully open about who you were came with risks that extended far beyond personal judgment. It could affect opportunities, relationships, and the way people saw your work. So she made a decision, not to deny that part of her life, but to protect it, to keep it separate from the noise, from the assumptions, from the limitations imposed by others. But that kind of separation isn't easy. Living authentically in your work while keeping parts of your life hidden creates a quiet tension, a constant awareness of what can be shared and what must remain private. And yet, even within that constraint, she didn't lose herself. She didn't let external expectations redefine her reality. Instead, she controlled the narrative. She chose when and how her truth would be seen. And in doing so, she maintained something rare, a sense of self that remained intact despite the pressure to divide it. That balance, that quiet strength became an invisible part of her story, one that shaped her as much as anything the public ever saw. Time has a way of changing perspectives. What once feels uncertain, risky, or even controversial slowly becomes understood, appreciated, and eventually respected. And that's exactly what happened. The same qualities that once made her difficult to define became the very reasons she stood out. The same choices that once limited her opportunities became the foundation of her legacy. People began to see her differently, not just as a performer, not just as someone who entertained, but as someone who challenged expectations, someone who questioned the systems around her and refused to accept them without thought. Her work wasn't just about performance anymore, it was about perspective, about showing people something they hadn't considered before. Recognition followed, as it often does when the world finally catches up. Awards, praise, acknowledgement, all of it came. But what made it meaningful wasn't the recognition itself, it was the fact that it came without her having to change who she was.
She didn't adjust to earn it. She didn't compromise to receive it. She simply continued doing what she had always done. And eventually, that consistency became undeniable. The industry that once struggled to understand her now celebrated her. But the truth remained the same. She hadn't changed for them. They had changed in response to her. And that difference is what made her journey truly powerful. Looking back, it's easy to simplify everything, to call it a career, a journey, a success story shaped by talent and timing. But that version misses something important, because what she experienced wasn't just growth, it was resistance. Not loud, not obvious, but constant. A quiet, ongoing struggle to remain authentic in an environment that rewards conformity. Every step forward came with a decision, every opportunity came with a condition, and every moment of success carried the possibility of compromise. But through all of it, she stayed consistent in one way that mattered most. She refused to become something she wasn't. And that refusal, repeated over time, became its own kind of strength. What makes her story powerful isn't just what she achieved, it's what she protected along the way. Her voice, her perspective, her identity, the things that are often lost in the pursuit of success. And perhaps the most remarkable part is that most people never saw that struggle. They saw the results, the recognition, the finished version of the story, but not the resistance behind it. And maybe that's what defines it best, because some of the strongest battles aren't the ones fought in public, they're the ones fought quietly, consistently, without recognition. The ones that shape who you become without anyone ever realizing what it took to get there. And that was her story. Not just success, but a war no one saw.